the first question for our panel tonight, really, I'm going to address first to Susan and then Mary, is how did you prepare yourself to serve on a board, and how long was the process to reach your first corporate board or private company board, and how did the opportunity come about?
So I've been on 3 private company boards now. 2 of those 3 were companies where I was a co-founder or a founder. And so my very first corporate board, I was 28 years old, I was a co-founder, and I was clueless in all candor. And there was no preparation whatsoever. We started a company. As part of starting a company and getting financing, you had to form a board. Like many startup companies, particularly if you have investors, the board is the founder, the co-founder, and an investor. And it's the 3 of you making decisions to run the company until such time you get more investors. And then another investor joins. What's been interesting for me about my situation right now is I am the founder of a company and I have a corporate board that helps me run that company. And I was very deliberate about who I chose to both be investors in my company, understanding now much better the role of governance and the decisions that a board makes about a company and a company's future, but also about the independent. And then in my case, I control 2 seats on my board. And so who I put in my own second seat was probably one of the most important decisions that I've made in my career as it relates to a startup founder. I also chose to accept simultaneously with starting this company, which might have been a little insane in hindsight, but I really did want to experience being on a corporate board. I'd been on a not-for-profit board for 10 years, but when I worked for the New York Times, we were not allowed to be on corporate boards. And so I accepted the opportunity to be the independent on the board of a local online media organization called Xconomy. Some of you may be readers. So I've gotten to watch what it's like to be the independent on a board with a founder and investors, and to see it from that point of view. And I have to tell you, it's been extraordinarily valuable to have both experiences, both to think about how I operate with the board as a founder and things to emulate and things not to emulate, but also to see what it's like to be an independent on a startup and what to think about. The one thing I would tell you about preparing myself for this other board that was really important to me, that I think came from the first experience of being a co-founder on a startup board, were 3 really important questions. What's my role? What do you want me to do on this board? Is it to be advice and counsel? Is it to help you fundraise? Is it to network or make connections? Why am I here, first and foremost? The second was to really understand the time commitment, because I think every board is really different in terms of how active the board is, how many committees there are, how many meetings there are, and especially given I was a founder of a startup, could I commit that amount of time? And the third was, where's the company at financially? Because I think when a company is doing relatively well financially and hitting its goals and has enough cash in the bank, especially in startups, the board is really helping think strategically about growth and partnerships and things like that. But when a company's running short on cash, potentially about to run out, that board is like rolling up the sleeves and trying to save the company. And having my own company, I didn't have 2 companies I needed to worry about. And so a lot of questions were just around the financial health, stability. And then the last one that was really important is, do I like these people? Do I like the people I'm going to be on a board with? Do I like the founder of this other company? Do I like the investors? And do I respect the decisions they're making? And in my case, I had the interesting situation of the investor in Xconomy was also my lead investor, and also somebody I'd been on the not-for-profit board with for 10 years, and so I knew him well. But those were the kinds of questions that I asked to prepare myself.
And Mary, what's your perspective on this?
Sure. So I wish I could say that I was very strategic about how I went about this, but I now kind of can see in retrospect how I prepared to have these opportunities, but it wasn't as plodding or logical maybe as it should be. I was a CEO, as Henry mentioned, of advertising agencies for quite a while. I was in my last position for about 8 years or so, running the Americas region for Saatchi and Saatchi, which is a pretty substantial global advertising agency. And what was great about the preparation, which led me to my board positions, which I'll mention in a minute, coming from the agency business, is really twofold. I had operating experience because I was running the professional services company, and it was a global company, which I think is important. But probably even more significant, I was in a position to have worked with CEOs and CMOs in a lot of business sectors. So from packaged goods companies like Procter & Gamble and General Mills to technology companies like Lenovo, retailers, beer companies, all sorts of categories. Even though I was in a vertical, the agency business, most of my career, I had a pretty broad purview of different kinds of experiences. Not only different kinds of sectors, but different kinds of challenges. I had the opportunity to work on new product launches. I often had to work with brands that were in need of revival or had to respond to a competitive development in the marketplace, so on. So I had operating experience and then pretty broad sector experience. I had started to think that I'd like to serve on a public board and started to do some research about how to make sure I could articulate what I thought the current and important skill sets that I brought to bear would be. So for me, I was certainly not a financial expert or financial wizard. Yes, I had P&L responsibilities, but let's face it, a marketer or an advertising person is really not going to be selected for a board because of their deep financial experience. But you started to notice and read that boards were increasingly interested, as I think they should be, in people that had consumer insight, consumer marketing skills, international, global skills, and also, importantly, and I think this is a real hot area right now, people that had some experience with digital, social marketing, data and analytics, right? And so I thought, even though it's advertising, I kind of have touched a lot of these kinds of types of subject matters through my work with the clients. So I guess I started to talk to people a little bit about it. I must have, because an executive recruiter called me about a wonderful opportunity on a public board called PVH, which is where Henry is the lead director, as it so happens. And it's a apparel company. Had started out in men's heritage businesses, dress shirts and ties, Arrow venues and things like that, and had bought Calvin Klein company, which really catapulted it into a much bigger global business. And since then, we've really grown with an acquisition of Tommy Hilfiger and Warnaco most recently. But I think that the recommendation, I don't know for sure, that the executive recruiter had gotten on me was through the CEO of JCPenney, who was one of my clients. And so I think she had been networking and he had suggested me. So that was really a wonderful, wonderful thing. So a tip, I think, is to, let it be known if you're interested to colleagues and people you work with. I'm also now a director on a second public board, which is Host Hotels and Resorts, which is a REIT in the hotel and resort business, which is really fun and interesting too. And clearly that was also through an executive recruiter. And I know that they were looking for someone with consumer marketing, consumer insight, and some international experience, because really that business model is about choosing what resorts and hotels to buy and which ones to sell. So it's most of the people on that board are brilliant financial and real estate people. I'm there to think about, what do millennials like? What kind of hotels will be interesting to baby boomers? What markets in the world are hot? So it's an interesting role. And then I also was interested in, as I was exploring what kind of things I might want to do in my next chapter, I decided higher education. But I actually explored private equity and had the opportunity to get on a portfolio company, a small portfolio company in private equity business, which has been interesting and actually in many ways a lot busier than anything else. So for a lot of reasons, but that's my experience.
Okay, Julie, I'm going to change the question a bit here. What are some of the key items to know before working with an executive search firm? And how do you enhance your marketability to serve on a corporate board today?
So first of all, I think the other panelists have given a great overview of the types of things that we look for when we're recruiting board members. And I would put it, is that better? Didn't make a difference. Oh, it did. Okay, good. I think it comes down to three things that I would suggest if you're thinking about serving on a board that you think about. The first is to really excel at your day job. Be great at what you do and do it very well. And whether that means you're the CFO of your company or you're the head of marketing or you're running a business within your firm, just be really great at what you're doing. The second is to start to build your brand externally. And whether that means speaking at events, writing articles, getting to know people outside of your company. Mary happens to be in a business where she connects with people at her clients all the time, so they get to know her. A lot of people who work in companies that aren't in professional services don't necessarily have that same exposure, but there are ways to get it, and you should be thinking about it. Don't find yourself in a place where no one outside of your company walls has heard of you. There are ways to build your external visibility. And then lastly, network. The opportunities that come about for board positions, many come through search firms, but many don't even get there. And the more people who know that this is something that you're interested in, the more your chances are to sort of be in the right place at the right time when an opportunity arises. So whether it's letting people know, the CEOs of other companies, people who are serving on boards of other companies, women who have no capacity to take on another board, but will continue to get asked to do that, you want them to be able to say, oh, I don't have space, but please ask Mary. So those are sort of the three things that I would recommend you do to increase your odds.
Great, thank you. The next question for our panel, what has been the value to you serving on a board, and what have you learned?
So, serving on a board as an independent has been extremely fascinating with both my founder, as I mentioned earlier, hat on, just to be able to observe what does a good CEO look like? How does a good CEO prepare for board meetings? How does a good CEO raise, what kind of questions do they raise, et cetera? And so by being on a board and seeing how the CEO sort of interacts with the board, manages the board, and things like that, it's given me great advice for how to be a better CEO myself as it relates to board management and support. I think the other thing that I've learned is it's just really important. The boards make really, really key decisions. First and foremost, hiring or retaining or firing the CEO. But also in the case of startups in particular, and I don't know how much this affects public companies, but so many critical decisions come through the board about growth in particular. Should you expand globally this year or next year? And if so, why not? Should you take financing? And if so, how much and when and how? And so a lot of really critical growth and strategy decisions are made at the board level. And how you facilitate those decisions, how you make those decisions, how you get support for those, I really valued. I think the other thing, and this gets back a little bit more into, I think, the conversation about why diversity matters in the board, is that I've learned how important it is to have different voices at the table. I have board members who will regularly be on opposite sides of the aisle on topics. And so a diversity of perspective, a diversity of experience, but frankly also diversity, whether it's gender or background, is I think so critical to making sure it's a balanced conversation.
I agree with so much of what you said, Susan, about ultimately it helps you be a better CEO yourself. But I think I've learned so much. I'm just so grateful for having had these opportunities. Some that are pretty, obvious and more logical, and others that are a little more on the softer, more qualitative or style point side of life. So first of all, you get to see a whole new business and how it operates, which is a great learning experience. And for me, a much more holistic view of business, because whilst marketing has a lot to do with business, you're really not seeing firsthand things like a major acquisition and all the steps involved take place. So the learning experience is terrific. But maybe even more important is diversity of point of views and diversity of styles. I just have enjoyed so much seeing how different members of the management teams work, but also my fellow board members. and the different viewpoints and different ways of approaching problems and just managing themselves it's very, very helpful. You learn a lot about how to be a better listener, how to challenge in a much more constructive way. You're not in the seat of getting to say so much. You have to be judicious and thoughtful about the questions and comments you make. So I just think it's a tremendous, you get a lot of value out of service to board, and hopefully provide a lot of value to the company as well, and shareholders.
The next question really, what questions did you ask before agreeing to serve? And the second part of that is, what questions do you wish you had asked before you agreed to serve?
That's a really good one. Which questions did I think it's really, you have to look at the company, obviously, and see its record of success, and certainly you can pretty easily nowadays do research and read proxy statements. You can do the sort of the analytical view of the company. Finding out about the other people on the board and the management team, a little trickier. I think that you have to be a little clever about perhaps asking, because sometimes you just don't really get a lot of access to them. But there's people that serve people on boards or serve the management teams, like comm consultants, lawyers, recruiters. Those people can be quite helpful. I think that there weren't big surprises for me, particularly on my 2 public boards. I think that people were very forthcoming about how governance worked and what the expectations were, and they're very organized about time commitments and meetings and calls and committee work and things like that. The smaller one is a little less organized, and so that was a little surprising. I think I maybe should have asked a little more about how much time would be involved and what the commitment would be, but I don't even know if they would have known, is the thing. So.
One of the most powerful questions that I've learned to ask in lots of different situations, but I think applies to boards as well, is to ask the board chair, the CEO, or the other board members that you're meeting in the process is what keeps them up at night about this board. And the answer to that question is often very different than what the standard company pitch has been. That's when you really hear about what's going on. One of the things that was interesting for me recently is I had to fill a board seat, and it was my board seat on our own board, and I thought that the questions the person I was recruiting to be on the board and his process were really interesting. And so one of the things that he wanted to do was talk to a customer. And that's a little bit unusual for a board member recruitment process. So you want to talk to a customer, and what was a customer thinking and feeling about our product and our platform. And then he wanted to meet the head of sales. And so we had dinner in San Francisco with the head of sales. And this is someone who's just amazing and a huge win for us as a company. But the fact that in addition to meeting other board members, he really wanted that voice of the customer and the sales to really, because that's what matters at the end of the day. He was a technologist, so he could vet the technology. It was, does the market need it and want it? And so he went through that process, which I thought was interesting.
Julie, a question for you. From your perspective as a recruiter, how does a board candidate effectively assess a company, the CEO, the incumbent board, and its challenges and effectiveness before accepting a position?
Well, I think Susan and Mary have given everybody great suggestions on this. The good news is there is a lot of publicly available information on the company's performance. What Susan just mentioned is interesting, and I don't think most of my candidates are doing that, but I think it's an interesting thing, and why not, right? If you make it to that stage in the process, you want to feel very comfortable and confident that you're making the right decision. Sometimes candidates will ask to meet with the CFO, and certainly you should meet with the CEO and perhaps the CFO, but you've got to feel comfortable, particularly if you're going to serve on the audit committee. It's probably the group that most often wants to meet with the CFO, that this is a board that you're not only going to feel some chemistry with, which is why it's valuable to meet multiple directors during the process, but that you don't feel that you will be compromised or that your reputation will be at risk. So, I do think having an opportunity to meet as many members of the board beforehand and some of the members of the management team is something that anyone who's in this position should be looking to do.
Great. What's the one piece of advice for all three of you, really, that you'd give women in the room who want to serve on a corporate board?
Not to be repetitive, but I think it's think hard about what skills you have that are desirable and could be a fit for the needs of companies that you'd be interested in, and kind of in your own mind figure out what that match could be. And then in all the ways that are coming up here tonight, let it be known. Because it's fortunate if an opportunity comes to you and someone finds you, but I think you really enhance the likelihood of having the opportunity if you make it known through whatever networks you can find that you're interested in. And there's a lot of organizations that have postings and networking, as Julie mentioned. I just think you have to really kind of put your message out there to just expand the possibilities and enhance the likelihood.
And I guess what I'd say is think of it a little bit almost like you think about career progression. And it's a little bit of a leap to go from being in your day job to being on the board of a publicly traded Fortune 1000 company. If you've never been on a not-for-profit board or never been on a private company board, or been on your own company's board or something like that. And so, start young. I remember the first not-for-profit board I got onto was probably in my early 20s, and they just wanted to reach out to young people and get them more involved in the organization. I think once you start to be in those kinds of organizations, you also meet people who serve on other boards. I think the second thing to really think about is not only what you can bring to the board and your skills, in terms of what gap you potentially fill in the board, but what's a company that you'd really want to be involved with, and that you really want to help. And I would put a huge appeal out to think about Boston as a startup community. I was incubating in a floor that had 60 companies on it at one point in time. Every single one of those companies needs a board, and by the way, every single one of those companies needs help. They are two entrepreneurs who are fighting it out, and some are experienced, but most aren't. And so Boston has a great opportunity to get involved, whether it's through Techstars or other organizations, with startup technology companies, life sciences companies, et cetera, who need marketing skills, who need finance skills, who need these things. And it's a great place to learn and to get prepared and get connected to being on potentially, as you got more experience, gain more interest, or have a stronger network, to being on a public company board.
Julie, a question on social media, with particularly like LinkedIn and so forth, and what the issue is. It having to break through and get on that first board that opens up the other opportunities, or somebody that hasn't had that opportunity? What is the barrier, if you will, and how do you leverage, LinkedIn or other mediums other than just recruiters that may call you?
I'm a big fan of LinkedIn. I think that the opportunity to articulate who you are and what your value proposition is very compelling. Now, that may just mean, for many recruiters, being able to see the companies that you worked at historically. And, again, maybe just to take a step back, it might be helpful for me to demystify the search process. That'd be helpful, just to spend a couple minutes. So when we're asked or retained to recruit a board member, we start with the definition of what we're looking for, position spec, much as you would for an executive role. And we define what are the skill sets that the board is looking for in this person. And typically, it's the skill sets that are missing on the board in light of what the company's strategy is, and the fact that the people who are on the board today may not have the set of skills that are needed for the company to be successful in the future. And it may include digital, marketing, consumer knowledge, international, different depending on the company. And when we then start to build a list, it's really not scientific. We identify companies where people who've been the former CEO or chief marketing officer, let's say, or sometimes currently sitting at those companies if they're not competitive but happen to be in a space that's relevant. And we make a list of companies, and then people at those companies that we think would fit the specification. That list may have 100 people on it, may have 200 people on it. Maybe it has 80, but it's a big number. And we have research teams, and that's what they do. And they may use LinkedIn to find those people. We have a database that has millions of people in it, but it doesn't have 225 million, which is what LinkedIn now has. So, you have to avail yourself of those resources, and the more you populate them, the more we have access to more people. But essentially, that list gets to be something, let's call it around 100. And the search team then goes through that list very carefully. Many people on it, Korn Ferry's a big place. Other people have met them. We may have placed them into an executive job before. We may have spoken to them as a reference on a search. We may have talked to them and they've given us ideas. But somehow we may have additional information on them that will help us say yes or no, keep them on, take them off. We get that list down to 25. That's what we would call the long list. Okay, that list of 100 is like, the target universe. But that's where it started. And we narrow it down. Let's say we get it to 24 for a single search. Sometimes it's 30. We share that list with our client, typically the search committee, which is either the entire nominating and governance committee of the board plus the CEO, sometimes a subset of it, and go through that list of 25 profiles with the board search committee. They will then narrow it down to something smaller. We call that a short list. That short list may initially be about 10 or 12. As we get more information, and information like someone on the board knows someone that knows that person, that makes them either stay on the list or fall off the list, depending on what the information is. The company's doing a deal with the company that the person works at. Oh, got to take them off, there'd be a conflict. But the list of, let's say, 12 people that we really dig deep on becomes 3 to 5. That's the real kind of shortlisted candidates. Those candidates typically interview. We certainly would meet all of those people in person. They then would interview with the search committee, and then the search committee would select one. So today, most boards are meeting, I'd say, at least 3 candidates, but probably not much more than 5 per board search, which, by the way, is up from what it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you went in order, and the person who was at the top of the list was met. And if you liked them, you stopped, right? But as the world has changed and people are much more narrowly focused about what they're looking for, people are open to seeing more people. And the world out there recognizes that just because they've been interviewed for a board search doesn't necessarily mean they got it. So anyway, after it's narrowed down to, let's say, 3 people that are met, we will conduct references, and then typically one person gets a seat.
Thank you. Shifting gears a bit, what has been the benefit of having women on boards of companies you've served, from your perspective?
So in our case, I think not different than consumer companies, which I think you'll hear a little bit about. Many of our buyers are women, the people who are buying our products and our services. Many of the users of our products and services are women. And I think as a result, having a balanced perspective about both your buyers' needs and your users' needs in the boardroom, particularly in the early stages. In an early stage company, a lot of the conversations are product oriented in the first couple of years, and making sure that there's not just one perspective in the room about what's going to be appealing to the buyer or the user is super important. If anybody has used software that was clearly designed by one gender and not the other has experienced this. So I think in general, technology companies, commerce companies have recognized 85% of household purchasing decisions are made by women. We're a very powerful purchasing group in the corporate workplace. That's happening too. And therefore products need to appeal to, and so the voice of the customer is something often women in the boardroom are asked to proxy for.
Diverse teams, diverse groups get better results. I've read those metrics before. It's just true. I mean, ROI, return on sales, return on invested capital, or return on equity is just true. Diverse teams. A.G. Lafley, the former CEO of P&G, wrote a great book about diverse teams always performing better than non-diverse teams. And it really doesn't matter what kind of homogenous teams they are. It's just the fact that diverse teams do better. They may get it added a little more slowly, but they always do better, particularly in terms of innovation and new products. I think for me in the boardroom, it's just that there's different voices and different opinions and different ways of looking at things. And I can't say that all, I happen to be on boards, in the case of PVH, there's 3 other women, and in the case of Post, there's 2. So, you know, I think I was trying to calculate what we are, but we're good. We got a good letter. So for me, so it's hard for me to say. So the women bring this, which is different than what the men bring. There's just different voices and different thought processes. Perhaps the women bring a little. I agree with what you said. They tend to ask some really good questions. There may be perhaps a little more apparent empathy for some of the things that the CEO, the management team are going through. But for me, it's really, it's about the blend and the value of just different points of view and different perspectives.
This question, Julie talked about the search process when a firm hires a Korn Ferry or any executive search firm to do a search. Your experience is both in either a new company or an established company. How does a board, how does the CEO think about what skills they need and your experiences around the table and how to fill those in your personal experiences?
Sure. Having had to build 2 boards now, it's been a very interesting process, and it actually changes over time. And I think that's the other thing. What a startup needs in its first 2 years is very different than what it needs in year 3 and 4 and year 5 and 10. So in the beginning, as I mentioned, product is a huge, and getting product market fit. And so making sure that you've got people who can help you in that process. And so one of my most valuable board members was the former CTO of Lotus, and he was on my first board that I was on, and he was one of the first people I brought onto the second board because he's a product person. What I needed now that we are very commercial and growing and scaling is I needed also a CTO that really understood how to run an enterprise SaaS business, but who also understood sustainability and also social media. And there's like one person in this world I could think of who fit that profile. Thank God he said yes. So, you know, you really start to think about it. But I also, an important thing for me as a CEO is I also wanted to know who's the person I'm going to pick up the phone to ask for HR advice. And team, especially about your leadership team. And I think there's always tough decisions around that. So who's the person on the board you're going to call? One little thing just to build a little bit from the small company, private company side is startups don't hire recruiters to fill board seats. So one thing is if you are interested in serving on a startup board or a private company board, those being necessarily 2 different groups, is you really do need to network in with the investor group, and particularly there's a number of organizations, Launchpad Capital, Common Angels, and others who get in early and seed fund startups, and they are always looking to help their CEOs create boards. There's incubator organizations, but you don't have the luxury as a CEO of getting to call a search firm. So you really do have to do the heavy lifting yourself. And so the more people that raise their hand and say, I'm interested, the more helpful that is to the CEO.
Mary, what's been your experience?
Well, you know, I have far less experience than Susan and Julie in how to actually build a board because I've never built one for a company, and I don't serve on a nominating or governance committee. I'm on compensation committee in both of my boards. But what I have observed is that as companies grow and expand and as they develop their strategic plans, different kinds of skill sets are valued and therefore then sought in new board members. And I think we've already talked about global and international. We've talked a bit about digital and social and consumer insight. But I think what you hit on is really important, and I know we've talked about it a lot in one of the boards, and that is talent, human resource. It's so important when you think of one of the most important responsibilities of the board is about CEO succession and in making sure that there's bench, and yet I think far too often boards really don't have representation of people that have really truly been in the talent business. And I don't necessarily mean that they have to be an HR professional, because in that case it may be difficult to then also get, you know, P&L and operating experience. But people that have had to build teams and really think carefully and have a lot of experience about recruiting and developing, training and growing and blending a team that can be successful. So I think focus on people with skills and instinct and interest, frankly, in the human capital side of the equation is really important.
Julie, what have you found in your business as far as the most in-demand skill sets today the companies are asking for?
The good news and the bad news. The good news is that it has changed, and I think it has changed in a way that creates more opportunity for women to serve on boards than, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. So when I've been in this business for 10 years. When I started, everybody wanted a sitting CEO. 10 years ago, the average S&P 500, the S&P 500 CEO on average served on 2.1 outside boards in addition to his or her own board. Today, it's 0.5. So half of the CEOs of the 500 largest companies, same stats hold true for the Fortune 1000, aren't even serving on an outside board. And that's because either their boards don't let them, they don't have the time to do it because the time requirement's so much more than it used to be, or there are other reasons. But the bottom line is that opens up opportunities for people who are retired or people who may not be CEOs and have other expertise. At the same time, companies are looking for board members to really contribute, whether that means to mentor someone on the management team, or to provide insights into the customer. And the types of people that people come to us for have become increasingly specific. So I'll just give you a little flavor of a couple of different searches that I'm working on. One of my clients is in the electronic trading business. So they have a platform for companies to trade securities. And they wanted to bring onto their board a chief technology officer who had experience with electronic trading systems to serve as a mentor to their chief technology officer. And 3 years ago, nobody would have ever said they wanted a chief technology officer, let alone someone who was, narrowly defined in their industry. But that was the criteria. So all of a sudden, that list of 100 I started with was really tough to get to 100, right? I'll start with a smaller number. I'm working with a couple boards in the REIT space, and they happen to be looking for people with really deep real estate investing experience because the people leaving their boards right now have that, and that's so critical. So at a search firm, or at least where I am, I partner with my industry counterpart. So the guy that runs our real estate business used to be the CFO for a publicly traded REIT, knows everyone in the industry, and when we need to put together a list of, who's been a real estate investor for the past 20 years, he has that information. So it really is very case specific what boards are looking for, but it is really specific now compared to what it used to be.
Do any of you have an insight in what discussions have been happening in your specific board's experiences on the type of talents that they're looking for now and in the future? I know I've heard generally about globalization, but is there any specific areas that come to mind that are areas that companies, I've read articles where cybersecurity, everyone's being hacked. Who is the right skill set for that kind of a role? Where do you find those kinds of people? Is that something that is in demand, in discussion, or is that something just that the press, writes about, and companies aren't deciding or discussing those kinds of issues today?
Oh, well, for me, by all means, these are exactly what that's why we get hired, right? Because they've tried, typically a board, there are the boards that have always used recruiters, and they, that's just sort of how they do a board search. Then I think there are boards that may in the past have done it through their own networks, and they've exhausted those networks, or the specification has become narrow because they bought a business. They're working for a billion-dollar company in the bank-to-bank payment space. And this is a company that enables mid-market banks to essentially look like Wells Fargo or Bank of America with their technology both behind the scenes and on your mobile device. so they don't have to build it in-house. And they were looking to bring someone on their board who had payments experience, and they had just exhausted their resources in trying to find their own directors for a couple other positions. So they hired us because they didn't know people in that space. It was where the growth was for their company. And we, showed them people they never would have known about or been able to find. As Susan said, it's a lot of work to find a board member that meets a specification. So, we throw a lot of resources at it. So those are, just examples of the kinds of people that our clients are looking for.
How do you continue to educate yourself in order to stay relevant and prepared for the challenges and opportunities businesses will continue to face in the future?
I did it by starting out making sure the board that I was on, that wasn't my own company, was still in the same industry, essentially, that I was in, and that leveraged the background of what I did before I started this company, which was online media and journalism. And so by not venturing too far out of my background and expertise, I knew that I'd be reading about these issues as part of my day job and wouldn't almost have like two different whole areas that I needed to. I think there's a couple things that I pay a lot more attention to now by being on boards, and that's the rules around everything related to securities law that is really changing fast right now, and also corporate governance and the things that you are now much more accountable for, much more responsible for as a board member than maybe 10 or 20 years ago, and just making sure I'm really aware of both the responsibilities and the obligations in that. In the tech industry, the issues you raised, globalization, security, all of those are things that we're living with day in and day out. So fortunately, that's something that I have to do both at day job and on my other corporate board.
I'd have a similar answer. The work that has to happen in my role as a CMO around social media and data analytics and whatever is state of the art in progress in marketing, I believe is going to be what's most relevant to and transferable to the boards I'm on, because I believe that's why I'm there and that's the value I can add when those kind of issues come up. So there's that, and then there's just, I agree, staying current on all the rules around directors and particularly in the area of compensation. You really have to stay up to speed. We consultants, really competent consultants that boards bring in to advise, all play a good role in helping to make sure that you're alert, up to speed, and understanding. And also continuing education. As a director, I think it's really important to go and attend. I try to go to a conference or some sort of continuing education. If not every year, at least every other one. And there's many different organizations that do that, but I think that's another way just to make sure that you're current on governance and developments for board members, but also, again, exchanging information and benchmarking to the extent that you are not in a conflicting sort of conversation with people in other boards. And then, the vertical industry you're in. I mean, it's really important, and I've got really good ones, so this is not hard work, right? To read about clothes is really not so hard. It's pretty fun, and the same thing with hotels and resorts. It's not bad. So, which I'm making a little bit of a joke, but honestly, back to one of your earlier questions, Henry, and I know it's difficult to find a board, so we all can't be so choosy, but I actually think, for me, I've always done better in subject matters that I actually find inherently interesting, that are fun, that pique my curiosity, or just interesting, and so that's a way to just keep up to speed.
I want to add one skill set that I think has been underappreciated to date, and that is going to continue to be a bigger and bigger issue on boards, and that is actually sustainability, and that happens to be obviously the industry I work in, but there are more and more board committees being formed around the intersection between sustainability and risk. There's a lot of changing rules about what companies are going to have to report and standards and corporate reporting around this, and so if you have a background or interest in environment, sustainability reporting, or any intersection between those things, You know, I do think there's going to be more and more call for those needs on boards in the future. At least the CEOs are really seeing this as a major issue. I don't know if you've had any experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Enterprise risk management and, you know, consumer social responsibility, corporate social responsibility. A lot of discussion, you know, for in businesses that manufacture, often offshore. There's a lot of challenging issues, and then, you know, health and well-being, big issue. Sustainability. So yeah, I think that's a really important value add that a director could bring to a board.
Well, now that the audience has had a chance to listen to our panelists, I thought it'd be appropriate that we ask anyone in the audience that has a question. This is your time, so we're not going to let them go yet. So who has any questions for the panelists? Yes.
My question is, obviously this is something that's very close to our hearts. Our mission is the advancement of women leaders. What advice would you have for the Boston Club in terms of how we can further strengthen our advocacy for this key cause?
Did everybody hear that just because she wasn't on mic? Do you need to repeat it? Or?
That's, let's see, do we have a?
I might, I'll take
why don't we do
the
this?
mic roll.
So I guess one thing I would say is we talked about how networking is so important in raising your hand to say you want to be on a board. You know, this may already exist, haven't heard of it, but a way for women who are at a certain level in the corporations in the Boston area who are interested in serving on a corporate board, being able to essentially register their interest and their expertise, and then they could add. And so that there's a database that's available for boards, especially I think the private companies who just don't have the resources to have a recruiter. You know, if I'm saying, hey, I really need somebody who's an expert in, you know, inbound marketing, digital marketing, and SaaS business models to serve on a board, to know that that reference is there and I can at least get names and look it up. That's the kind of thing that I think, especially for smaller companies, would be really valuable.
Why don't you go ahead?
I'm Sheila Puffer. I'm a faculty member here in the DeMoore McKim School of Business. You talked about the really positive side and the learning side of being on a board. What happens when things go wrong? You have a lot of liability that you're responsible for. What are some of the challenges you've faced when there's been bad things to deal with?
I think I've been lucky.
Not me. So my first startup failed after 9/11. It was in Manhattan, and it failed due to a board vote. It was basically a 3-2 decision to shut down the company. 2 people thought we shouldn't, 3 thought we should, and so the decision was made to shut down and liquidate the company. And one of the directors, the independent, was literally standing, it was sort of a Khrushchev moment of banging his hand on the table and saying, this is un-American. You know, it might have been a really good decision. It might have been made for exactly the right reasons for the people who were making that decision. But it was a really, really difficult thing to watch because it wasn't necessarily about the fundamentals there and now. In this case, it happened to be what was happening in the broader context, and it happened to be because investors needed to shore up funds for companies that were earlier in their portfolio and needing to therefore pull back support from later companies or portfolio. And you learn all this as an entrepreneur, being like, what? You don't want to be the last investment in a fund? Why not? Well, that's why not. You know, and things like that. And so it was a really, really interesting lesson in just what can happen in a board. And that doesn't mean it was a bad decision. You know, the thing I want to emphasize is it doesn't mean that was a complete mistake and we shouldn't have shut down the company, and if we, you know, stayed open, we would have made it. We could have just limped along for 8 months and then, you know, not had enough cash to wind down properly and sell properly. But, you know, the decision was made, and you know, you learn the hard way, sort of, if you're on the other side of that vote, then needing to say, well, that's how the board voted, so now let's execute on what has to happen. And in my case, I was the leader of the company, and so I had to execute on the decision to wind down the company, sell the technology, et cetera, for the outcome of the board vote. And I learned an enormous amount in that process. But there's a reason why I'm very, very contemplative and process-oriented now about who's on my board, is I've seen what happens when times get tough. And I have seen what can happen if a 50-50 decision where it looks like, one person sways one way, what sways them? And so I think you just need to, that's more, I think, the advice for the CEO as they're building a board or a founder as they're building a board. But I think also just think of as a board member, what if you're on the downside of a decision that the company has to pursue and you're pissed about that decision? How are you going to continue to support the company despite disagreeing with the direction? And can you?
Yeah, I would add to that. I think actually the National Association of Corporate Directors, on their website, they have a lot of good materials. One is the kinds of questions you should be asking when you're interviewing the company or a potential board opportunity. What I've found in my experience is, who the CEO is and whether their values and their integrity align with yours, and who the other board members are. That's a very important conversation because you're only going to be one person. And if you're on the wrong side of where the majority might be, I joined a company once that I won't name that was based in the South, and they said, well, you don't understand. This is, Eastern Tennessee. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, we make decisions like this all the time. And I said, well, wait a minute, it's either right or it's wrong. And I wasn't, that's not my value set. And what are you talking about? And there were only two board members, myself and somebody else who happened to be a corporate attorney, fighting the CEO, who was the controlling shareholder, and the rest of the board, who just didn't want to be involved. And we were a public company. We could have been sued. Ultimately, it was resolved. So the idea of, it may be attractive to want to go on a board and gain that experience. Believe me, the compensation is never enough for the liability. It isn't at all. You better like the business, like who's running the business, and your fellow board members, because there are going to be times when you're on different points of view than management, and you have to, like in a university, collegiality is kind of the standard. It's really important. I think you find pretty quickly on a board that's important too. Not that you're always agreeing with management, but there's a whole process involved in that, and it's very tricky, particularly if a company doesn't have funding, if it's a startup or an early stage company where proof of concept hasn't happened. A lot of things could happen, and is everyone going to be comfortable making the right choices? Other questions from our audience, and we have a mic here, so if whoever right here in the front, okay, if you would go up to the mic, then everyone can hear it also online.
Hi, my name is Donna Latson-Gittens. I own an advertising agency called More Advertising. I'm also a graduate of the Northeastern Business School with an MBA. My question is for Julie. And how often do big Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies look to entrepreneurs as board members versus women who've come up from corporate experience? I do have corporate experience, but I left to start my own.
Yeah. Not that often.
Right.
I've had one search. I've had one search. But by the way, I shouldn't say that. Not that often through a recruiter. So I actually think that if you were to look at boards, they probably do have more entrepreneurs than I would be aware of, because those are the people that they would meet through their own avenues. I've had one search where it was a $500 million, it wasn't even a Fortune 1000 company, $500 million medical device company, like batteries for medical devices mostly. And they wanted to bring onto their board someone who had commercialized the technology, because they had a new technology that they really wanted to see grow and become much more, a much bigger part of their business than what their core business had been. So they asked us to look for people who were entrepreneurs, who had essentially, developed and discovered a technology and then commercialized it. So it wasn't just finding somebody who started a company, but actually grew it to 100 million in revenue or whatever. But that's about as close as I've gotten to, the sort of pure entrepreneur work.
Although I would say the point that one of our panelists made around getting involved with investors, VCs, I have a fund. We don't do early stage investing. We do later stage investing. But one of the key things we look for in board members that we bring on companies we own or invest in is certainly the relevant experiences in the particular area of that business, but people who know how to communicate well with the management team, because you want people that are going to want to listen. So the fact that somebody has entrepreneurial experience in an earlier stage company, typically that's what you know, venture capitalists or investors are looking for, people with the relevant skills, but the ability to relate and then be able to communicate and really add value. So I think that's a great suggestion, and it's probably a lot more relevant than a search firm. Yes, you had a question.
Hello, I'm a software engineer. I'm a technologist, but I am in the, what it says, at the deep end of the technology. I do releases, software releases, and I have experience releasing software for 18 years. And I always debated get out of technology and get into, you know, other positions. But I'm wondering, I also serve on board in a nonprofit board for 6 years, and also, you know, I'm a trustee at a building. I am in the board there, and I'm wondering, do companies consider people who are really like doing the technical work, or who they rather, you know, work directly with the CTO? Because that's the difference.
Well, again, I think this is kind of big company, small company question, right? So it's probably better for Susan to answer it. My guess is you've got maybe more need for that than my clients, right? So that I gave you the example of the chief technology officer who was, you know, that a board was really looking for. It was very relevant to that company that person had started as a technologist and had started sort of writing code, even though she ultimately had been managing a global technology organization of thousands of people. When she started as, you know, somebody who really got her hands into the technology.
Right. I think in small companies, you are generally looking for the governance board of a startup, people who've been in a leadership role. You want to know that they've been leading a division, an organization, senior. But startup companies often have advisory board roles, and that's often where companies will look to add somebody who can advise the company on how to do very specific things, whether it's marketing or QA and software releases or things like that. And so advisory boards is probably a better way with your specific skill set to start working with startups. And then as you have more advisory boards under your belt, and, you know, potentially work with a company that then scales and grows and sees you as sees your skills as valuable, and you start to get more leadership experience in that, that can transition into potentially a governance role.
Okay, great, thank you.
My name is Anna Shaughnessy, and I'm with MIT. And my question has to do with I'm clearly in sort of the third phase of my career, so there's a long laundry list of things that I have done in different companies, and I'm curious, how do you, or is there a way to prepare your CV to make it attractive to a board search company?
Sure. Yes. You know, I think there's a language around this. People call it your board bio. Typically a one-page snapshot of who you are. And frankly, I would view it as, what's your value proposition to the board you think you would like to serve on? And I do think this goes back to, and we've all talked about it, to finding the win-win, right? You want to serve on the board of a company that's looking for someone with your skill set. You don't want to be on the board of a company that's not, because it's not going to work out. And if you can articulate what it is that you've done about you and what you've done that makes you an expert in whatever area it is, I think it becomes much more compelling. And if you can summarize it and communicate it, that's, you know, in one page, that's helpful. I typically ask people to provide me their very detailed resume, like you would if you were applying for a job, as well as, if they have one, a bio, which essentially articulates their value proposition as a board member.
And then do you use that kind of like search engine optimization? Are there keywords that you search seriously in LinkedIn, or as you look at these bios? Is there any sort of
No, I mean, I wish I had that level of data and analytic capability. But I mean, the reality is, and I'm not typically looking at LinkedIn for board members. I'm using more traditional. The people that we're looking for are typically visible on the company's website. if they're not, or I know what I'm looking for, right? So I can go to LinkedIn and say, or somebody on my team goes to LinkedIn and says, show me who the chief technology officer is at Goldman Sachs. And if you can't find it on your website, then it's on LinkedIn. Whatever shows up first in the Google search when you type in chief technology officer of Goldman Sachs is sort of where we go just to get that name. And then, again, for the more publicly visible people that we target, there's enough information in the public domain for us to find that. But LinkedIn always helps. If someone is positioning themselves with a very clear value proposition on LinkedIn, it's only additive. I never view that as, oh, wow, they're really overselling themselves. I just view it as more transparency into things that they have done that I might not have known about, which is why I like it when people send me and I will ask for their detailed resume, because they will articulate on there, grew a business from 0 to 100 million, took a company public, commercialized a technology, whatever it happens to be. So I think there's a need for these two different resources to be able to communicate it.
The other thing I would just say, since I think I can see on your name tag it says MIT, or you mentioned that you're at MIT, if you are in the academic sector here in Boston, most of your universities, if they have an R&D capability or facility, have a technology transfer office. And that office is about licensing the technology to groups of people who are about to go start a company. And if you are interested in helping do that, that's a great resource to start getting connected to entrepreneurs and people like that, and a way to get involved early stage in a company. And I think there's at least 5 or more universities here who have those kinds of tech transfer offices that could help.
Any other questions?
So I was just curious about the pipeline, and maybe this is more in the recruiting. So when you do the long list of 100 and then the short list of 30, are you at these numbers, the 20% for women? And if not, what can we do about preparing more women to be visible, to be on these lists?
So
like what happens right before you get the board
Right, so it's a great question. And I guess 2 things I'd want to say about it. And I think Susan said it earlier, or maybe Stephanie, you started with it. This is a real opportunity for women to have a voice at the table where it really counts, which is in the boardroom. And to the extent that women aren't aware or aren't being encouraged of the importance of being in the boardroom, that's where I feel like we as women are falling short. People don't appreciate how important it is for women to be in the boardroom so that these decisions that are being made with diverse voices and in the best way, and that we're a part of it. So I feel like, there's an education process that has to happen for all of us, with our daughters, with the women that work with us, about an expectation of, being at the table. I think Sheryl Sandberg did a great job in her book putting this forth, and I really believe that that's where this starts. An expectation of, we should be in the room, it's important for business, it gets better results, and I'm going to aim for that. The second piece of this is, to your point, how do we get more women on the lists? So we are very conscious about this. And whether it's 20%, 30%, 50% of the slate, I do everything I possibly can to pull more women into that funnel. And if we have a list, the CTO example I gave earlier, it's a really sparsely populated list of women. And it's remarkable that our candidate was a woman, because actually we had just placed on that board another woman. So they kind of relaxed the woman constraint. And the fact that this person was a woman was just lucky. She happened to be the most qualified person for the job, and a woman. And it just sort of started to pay back in spades, because the CEO said, wow, and we didn't even know this, but the fact that she's a technologist and a woman is critical, because we're really having a hard time retaining women technologists. So the fact that this is a big part of who she is critical to us. But we do that all the time. I've had clients now, and I think that this is where people like Henry or Susan can challenge their board or the recruiting firm and say to them, I want to see 50% of the slate women, or I want to see 100% of the slate women. I was telling somebody earlier, I was speaking with the CEO this week, and he said that the way he's been able to get more women onto his board is he's now made gender a criteria. So on his skill matrix of where it says, deep consumer knowledge, former chief marketing officer, woman. Because 70% of his customers are women.
Right.
And if you can't check that woman box, then you're not qualified for this search. So it's, it's a little bit of an aggressive move, but there is something about, constraining or requiring certain percentage of your slate to be diverse.
I almost jumped. Yes. That was a great question. And here's a really boring one that unfortunately may relate only to me, and I apologize. Let's assume that someone is a lawyer. Has started as a litigator, is completely reformed, I promise you, and has been an in-house business counselor, strategic counselor on executive committees, but in a legal or compliance role for many years in the life sciences industry. Okay. I have heard in having this conversation with other recruiting firms that the pendulum swings back and forth about whether or not people are willing to accept a non-operating executive or are looking for a lawyer. And I'm sure it's very dependent on the kind of company. And I suspect in a startup arena, you're looking for more operational expertise. But general thoughts on the legal role on boards?
I'm happy to answer it, but I'd rather let you guys go first.
I really don't know. Henry, you might want to take that one.
I think it's if a company is going public and the CEO or the management team doesn't have a lot of experience, I've been on boards like that where we specifically went out and recruited a general counsel. One of the sensitivities I've always had is sometimes decisions that are the right decision for the company, you don't want somebody with just great legal experience and a mindset to scare the heck out of everyone else in the boardroom. And I think that's the bias a lot of times that companies have, whether they have a general counsel or they use a third party. But there are certain industries, you think of the banking industry today, it's so litigious. There are certain categories, I'm sure the real estate REITs, there's where legal, skills would probably be very important. Okay, on any board makeup. So that's been my experience, but I don't know what it's been in others.
I think what I'd say for the startup world is that there are certain kinds of startups where growth is really tied to strategic business development deals that have a very strong legal component to them. And particularly as a young company, you often can't afford that person full time, but you still need somebody who can really help you navigate this strategic business development. And I know life sciences businesses happen to be like that. It's all about getting that licensing agreement with Merck or whoever. And so I would say that I think, but I could be wrong in life sciences, but I can see in tech that having a board member in the early days who was really, really good at strategic legal business development would be really, really valuable if that was one of your key growth strategies and it didn't make sense for that role to be an in-house full-time role.
And I would concur with that. The lawyers that I've known who've served on boards and were lawyers, right? There's lots of lawyers. I actually was on a panel at Harvard Law School on this topic recently. But about 9% of all board members of the Fortune 1000 have a law degree. The majority of them were lawyers and then something else, CEO, something, in a senior management role. So that is not the question that you asked. But I do think that the lawyers that I've known who were lawyers like you who ended up on boards may have been a partner in a law firm or somehow worked with someone on that board, got on the board when it was still privately held, and then when the company went public and they were independent, stayed on the board after that. And there is something, we haven't talked about it today, but there is something to having served on a board that kind of lets you check that I've been the director at a public company, so I have that knowledge and could serve on another one. That starts to happen when that happens.
I'd also say that I'm a mediator, and I suspect that skill can be helpful on boards as well. So,
Absolutely.
So I'd like to include the moderator in this question. So what do you think what is the block? What is keeping more women from getting on boards? Just from, not from the pipeline, not from what women can do, but what from your knowledge from being on boards is really the obstacle?
But I think it's because we haven't talked about where women are in industry in general, and the percentages of women CEOs, and anything with a C in front of it is still arguably low, and there may be a couple categories that it's robust, but not in anything I've read. So the fact that so it's actually very good news, and it's really edifying to learn that boards are getting more specific about the kind of skills they want, and not maybe therefore as attached to the notion of someone with a C in front of their name or having run a big P&L. But to the extent that there's, up until this point, to the extent that there's just not enough women in those qualifying positions, it's just, if a board's criteria was you got to be one of those, it's just going to be a bad mathematical equation. So I really think that is probably the block. I'm certainly not aware of, but maybe there are some boards where CEOs or nominating and governance committees or lead directors disagree that having women would be a good thing, or disagree that a certain amount of diversity may be helpful, but it's probably won't be. I can easily see executives who aren't flexible enough to consider less, traditional job descriptions. Must be a CEO, for instance. The other thing I imagine gets to the issue, and it hasn't come up yet tonight, I'd love to hear about it, is tenure. How long is a good amount of time to be a board member? Because you could argue different things, that the value of a deep experience in the company and, with experience and with understanding comes a depth of knowledge that allows you to be a better contributor. And then you could argue that fresh opinions, new sets of eyes are really valuable as well. And boards aren't going to get big, much bigger than they are. It's just really, again, a little bit of a numbers game, I think. And so an issue really I think that we should discuss is longevity. What's the appropriate amount of time? There may very well be a lot of boards that would like to have and are open to new skill sets and diversity, and just don't know what to do with their perfectly fine aging directors.
I agree with everything you said, and I'd add that I think two other factors. One is just take a company that was mentioned earlier this evening that when it went public recently had no women on its board. I don't think they ever talked about it before, and then they got hammered for it right before. But I bet they never had a conversation about it. It just wasn't top of mind. And there are lots of reasons to say, oh, we can't find people, but that's kind of hogwash. There are plenty of people in technology that would have been a good board member for that company. It just didn't come up. That said, I do think an issue on high-tech boards of privately held companies or any venture-backed business is that 2/5 on average, or 3/7, or more of the seats are held by investors. Guess who are usually not women? Are the investors in these companies. And if you look at the number of women partners in venture capital firms and women partners in private equity firms and people who are investing, it just means there isn't necessarily as much diversity for those investor seats either. And so then you think about it, you've got two in any company situation, you've got 2 founder seats, let's call it, 2 investor seats. That's 1 open slot, truly, that you're looking to fill. And I think that starts well, we didn't talk about it because really there was only 1 extra seat, and I wanted this person who was in my last company to be in it.
And I think I'd add, in Europe, there's certainly begun threshold mandates, okay? And the U.S., hasn't got there. I don't think there's any good reason why we don't have that. I think it's really about what we've said earlier. I think Julie talked about, with daughters, with yourself, it's all advocating. I have 3 children, 2 are daughters. We raised them to believe they could do anything they wanted, okay? And I think it isn't a discussion that happens enough. On one of the boards that Mary and I sit on together, we decided that we wanted a minimum amount of women. We wanted skill sets, but we wanted a diverse board. And that was one of the requirements. And as we look at changing people as they retire, or we need different skill sets, that's part of who we are. And there are great organizations like the ones that are sponsoring this event tonight that I think are important in advocating that, because there's no logical reason. Hopefully someday soon we'll have a woman president. And maybe that's what it will take to finally put this not as something that's evolving, but actually has arrived. But there's not a logical, conclusion other than, we're behind the times, and, there are enough examples of very talented women. One of the companies we invested in was a footwear and apparel company called Ariat, and the founder was a woman, very talented in San Francisco. When we became investors, the whole board was women. The majority of senior managers were women. And both my partner and I, it was like, my God, we've never seen that, okay? Now, it turned out to be a terrific company, terrific investment for us. The conversations, it was a retail consumer business, so it was very appropriate because the consumer was the people who were sitting around the room, and a couple of guy investors who, we couldn't even relate to the product. We had a financial acumen, and we were bringing the money to scale the company. But it worked, and it was very, very successful. So I don't think there's any good excuse left. I think it just has to happen sooner than later. We have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Marty Jones, CEO of Mass Development, and this has been a great panel for all of us today to hear about opportunities. I want to bring it back, I think, to Stephanie, and it's more of a couple of observations rather than a question. I have a family relative who is a senior partner in a Delaware corporate law firm, and at a recent family event, I said to him, so, how about this issue of women on boards? And I got a total blank stare. So I wonder if playing the inside-outside game, maybe we need to do some work in Delaware, where a lot of these major public companies are based, to try to work another angle to make some of them a little more aware of these issues. And the second one, I want to say my dad, who's 86, loves this initiative. And I think there are a lot of people who are our parents and older people who have the time actually to read their proxy statements and to vote their proxies who are out there, and to remember to advise them about what's going on here and encourage them to vote those proxies and advocate for their daughters and granddaughters who are in positions to be on boards would be a great thing for us to remember as we leave this evening. So this has been great, and I want to thank you all.
Well, before we break up, I want to ask Kate Carlton, who's helped organize this event, to come up. She has a few final words.
That's really terrific.